Hello and welcome to the Justice Factor. The new South Africa is 20 years old. How far have we come? How far do we still have to go? My guest this week to discuss South Africa at 20 is well-known public intellectual and Rector of the University of the Free State, Professor Jansen. After that discussion, we'll give you, as usual, our winner and loser of the week. But first, our discussion on South Africa at 20. We visited Professor Jansen in Mangaung, and I began by asking him if we have a good story to tell.
Look, I think we definitely have a good story to tell. Having lived, like most of us, on both sides of 1994, we sometimes forget what an unbelievable mess we were in and also how precarious the transition was. You know, I mean, you remember the Midlands, you remember the hostels in Gauteng, in Soweto. I mean, we were in a very dangerous situation. It was by no means certain that we would have a straight line to democracy and elections and a new government and so on. And yet we emerge relatively unscathed. And I think the fact that we have all the formal arrangements for democracy, whether it is the ability to vote in peace, the ability to create the kind of spaces in which people can express themselves openly and publicly on social media, in the news, I think we actually have a very robust democracy. And then, of course, all the formal arrangements for democracy, from Section 9 institutions to, you know, all the appeals to the courts and so on. I don't think we're doing too badly in terms of the formal arrangements for democracy. Where I think the thing falls flat is when it comes to the daily experiences of ordinary citizens when they don't feel that the benefits of these formal arrangements translates into short lines, waiting for a social grant without the threat of being robbed when you move around the corner, the access to a good quality education system that is at least equal to what happens in the more established and former privileged schools. Security, that when I walk around in this country, I don't get killed. And the faith in leaders that in fact represent in their behavior the kind of values that are formally encoded in the Constitution, etc., etc. That, I think, is the day-to-day experience of democracy in terms of the material and social and spiritual well-being of people. That's where the thing falls flat.
When you talk about how things translate into the day-to-day, I've just walked 3 kilometers across town to your office here, and I felt absolutely, totally free. But I know that in this city as well, in Mangaung, Bloemfontein, you've had service delivery protests just outside of the city. And we have 32 a day in South Africa, according to the police. What's leading to that? What's the frustration coming from?
I mean, depending on where you are and at what time of the day you walk and which parts of the suburbs, you encounter.
That is true. It was middle of the day.
Exactly. You could have a wonderful experience and think that's the country, right? But think of the person living in a shack, with a very dodgy electrical set of connections that are illegal, in which, there are constantly people watching to see whether they can rip you off or hurt your girl child and so on and so on. In that kind of stressful daily, I mean, in places like Hanover Park, and other parts of the Cape Flats, I mean, every day there's 2 or 3 boys that get shot down. So I think, it depends on who you are and where you are and how much you have. And then the world looks either less tragic or more tragic. I'm always amazed that I can sit in certain conversations in which people are so incredibly well ensconced against the worst features of inequality and poverty, and be in a completely different situation with this, what I call the daily grind to survive.
You spoke about the institutions and the formal arrangements, and you mentioned the Chapter 9 institutions, for example. Are those 20 years later, 18 years later, after we adopted this constitution, are they holding up? Are they under threat? Are you positive that they will come through some of the pressures that they're experiencing currently in 10 years, in 20 years?
I'm very optimistic, but it depends very much on the vigilance of civil society. If civil society remains vigilant, then I don't think we've got anything to fear. But if you take it for granted that there could be a series of bills, that threaten to go through Parliament in which media expression is clamped down on, if you don't have these sectional rights groups, that can take the government to court for not delivering textbooks, in the Eastern Cape or Limpopo, if you take for granted, the fact that simply by voting people into power that they will do what they say they will do, then we're going to be in serious trouble. So I think that the vigilance, the activism, we now need a new activism. I'm so convinced about this. But a new activism that says to the people of Olifantshoek, for example, that it is your responsibility not to shut down the schools, but to keep them open and make sure that government delivers, on the basic things for which you can expect, like is your child gets a good school, the road gets fixed next door, etc., etc. Parents, particularly in poor areas, have disconnected from schools in a way that wasn't true, as you know, in the 1980s in places like Soweto, where there were parent-teacher activist groups that said, hell no, we will not accept this Bantu education from the apartheid government. We need to re-energize that activism so that people begin to understand, in the absence of that activism, all those institutions, all those formal arrangements will in fact come under greater threat.
Isn't that call for a new activism, for public voices, for people to stand up and do and speak, a call for people to move away from political parties in a way that politicians have let us down in these 20 years?
One of the most fascinating things, about South African society, but I suspect of societies that come out of long periods of oppression and so on, is that people love politics. Young people love to be engaged in political debate and belong to something, bigger than themselves, like a political party. I think that's always going to be there, But you need to make sure that people go into those kinds of activisms for the right reasons, not to seek a shortcut to wealth, not to seek a shortcut to personal enrichment or power, but in fact to mobilize those very important public organizations like a political party to enable us to achieve on behalf of other people. That said, there has to be an understanding that that is not the only way in which you can exercise activism. You can exercise activism through all kinds of civil society organizations, including churches, mosques, and synagogues, but also, through various kinds of sporting arrangements. Take, for example, this new move by FIFA. I think this is a global activism that's on the cards that I'm very excited about, to stamp out racism in sports, but in particular in football, because what's been happening in parts of Europe, for example, this attack on black players, etc. Just imagine this becomes the new activism for fighting racism, not just in sport, but in society. So I think we need to multiply the different kinds of civil society organizations that can act, against all kinds of social ills, while recognizing still the vibrancy and the attractiveness of political parties for many young people.
After the break, we asked Professor Jonathan Jansen why there are so many violent service delivery protests in South Africa.
News that moves. enca.com.